Boone County, North Carolina, February 1878. While his neighbors burned through cord after cord of oak just to keep their families from freezing, one man's cabin glowed with warmth that seemed almost impossible. The difference? A chimney so strange, so contrary to accepted building wisdom, that the local mason had called it an abomination against common sense. But here's what nobody understood at first. This wasn't ignorance. It was engineering that frontier America had forgotten. What did this Scottish immigrant understand about heat, stone, and physics that 3 generations of Appalachian builders had missed? Before we reveal the secret that changed an entire valley's approach to survival, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because what I'm about to show you might just save you thousands in heating costs this winter, and I want to know how far this knowledge spreads. Deal? Good. Let's get into it. Duncan McLeish arrived in Boone County in the spring of 1877 with little more than his stonemason's tools, a wagon of belongings, and a reputation that hadn't quite crossed the Atlantic with him. Back in Inverness, he'd been known for building hearths that held heat like the devil wouldn't let it go. But here in the North Carolina mountains, he was just another immigrant trying to prove himself before winter came. He claimed a modest plot along Cove Creek, with a valley narrowed and the wind cut through like January had teeth. The locals watched him work through summer, noting his odd choices with growing concern. McLeish selected his cabin site, not for the view or the water access, but for something nobody else seemed to consider, a southeastern exposure and a natural windbreak of stone to the northwest. "He's building backwards," observed Thomas Bradley, who'd constructed 17 cabins in the county and considered himself the authority on mountain building, putting his back to the good timber and facing into the weather. Man doesn't understand Carolina. But it was McLeish's chimney plan that really sparked the talk. In August, when he began laying the foundation, neighbors gathered to watch with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Where any sensible builder would place a chimney on the exterior wall, or perhaps in the center for maximum efficiency, McLeish was doing something that made no immediate sense. He was building it at an angle. Not a slight deviation, mind you, but a deliberate, calculated angle that seemed to defy every principle of proper draft and draw. The firebox itself sat recessed nearly 18 inches deeper into the wall than standard practice. And the stone he'd selected, hauled piece by piece from a quarry 5 miles distant, was a specific type of dense sandstone that most builders avoided because of its weight. "That stone's too heavy," Bradley told anyone who'd listen. "Takes twice the mortar, 3 times the labor. And for what? A fire's a fire. Heat rises, smoke draws. You don't need to reinvent the damn wheel." McLeish never argued. He simply continued working, his movements precise and deliberate, as if following a blueprint only he could see. By September, the structure of his chimney began to emerge, and the peculiarity of his design became impossible to ignore. The flue didn't rise straight up as God and good sense intended. Instead, it curved, creating what looked like a deliberate impediment to the very smoke it was supposed to expel. "It'll never draw," predicted Samuel Garrett, who owned the mill. "First fire he lights, he'll smoke himself out of his own cabin. Mark my words." The women were more direct in their assessment. "Poor man," said Elizabeth Norton, whose husband farmed the adjacent property. "Comes all this way just to freeze to death because he's too proud to ask how things are done proper." But McLeish had asked. He'd studied every cabin in the valley that first month, noting the soot stains on exterior walls, the way families clustered within 3 feet of their hearths while the far corners of their rooms grew frost on the inside walls. He'd measured the cord upon cord of wood stacked outside each home, calculating burn rates and heat retention with the quiet intensity of a man who understood that winter in these mountains wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a test of engineering as much as endurance. What he'd seen had troubled him deeply. These were good people, hard-working families, burning themselves into poverty every winter while their cabins bled heat into the mountain air. And they were doing it because that's how it had always been done. McLeish knew different. The question was whether they'd let him prove it before the first snow fell. By late October, with McLeish's cabin nearly complete, the ridicule had evolved from curiosity to something harder. Thomas Bradley made a point of bringing visitors by to observe what he called the Scottish folly. See that? Bradley would gesture at the chimney, which now rose above the roofline in its peculiar configuration. Man's got more stone in that chimney than most folks have in their entire foundation. And look at the angle of it, fighting the draft instead of working with it. That's what happens when you bring old-world thinking to new-world problems. The criticism gained authority when Reverend Michaels, who fancied himself educated in matters of natural philosophy, examined the structure after Sunday service. He stood before the chimney, hands clasped behind his back, and delivered his verdict like a judge pronouncing sentence. The principles of thermodynamics are quite clear, he announced to the small crowd that had gathered. Heat rises through the path of least resistance. By creating these obstructions, he gestured vaguely at McLeish's curved flue design. You're essentially trapping smoke and reducing efficiency. I've read Rumford's essays on fireplace design. This contradicts every established principle. McLeish, who'd been securing his roof beams, climbed down slowly. He was a man of perhaps 45, with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime arguing with stone. When he spoke, his Highland accent made some of the men smirk. I've read Rumford too, Reverend. Read him in the original, not the American Digest. And I've built 43 hearths in Scotland that would have made the man weep with joy. He paused, wiping stone dust from his hands. But I'm not here to debate. Come February, you're all welcome to measure for yourselves. Measure what? Bradley scoffed. How much would you waste trying to heat a cabin with a chimney that can't draw? We'll be measuring how long it takes before you admit defeat and let me rebuild it proper. The younger men laughed, but McLeish noted that some of the older residents remained quiet. Jonas Whitfield, who'd lived through the brutal winter of 1864, didn't join the mockery. Neither did Robert Hayes, whose daughter had nearly lost 3 toes to frostbite the previous January despite a fire that burned day and night. But they didn't defend him either. In frontier communities, especially ones where a bad winter could mean the difference between survival and tragedy, there was little tolerance for experimentation. Proven methods kept families alive. Innovation was a luxury for those who could afford failure. The social pressure extended beyond mere words. When McLeish asked the general store to hold an order of additional mortar on credit until spring, he was refused despite his prompt payment on all previous accounts. When he offered to help repair the Norton's collapsing root cellar, work he could have completed in a day, Elizabeth Norton politely but firmly declined. "We appreciate the offer, Mr. McLeish," she said, not meeting his eyes. "But my husband prefers to handle our own affairs." The message was clear. Prove your chimney works, or remain an outsider. November arrived with its first freeze, and McLeish completed his cabin. The structure itself was unremarkable, a standard 20 by 24-foot single-room design with a loft. But that chimney, that impossible chimney, dominated the eastern wall like a stone monument to stubbornness. Bradley organized what he called an inspection on the first day McLeish lit his fire. Nearly a dozen men gathered outside the cabin at dawn, waiting for the smoke to billow back, for McLeish to come stumbling out with streaming eyes, admitting defeat. Instead, a thin, steady column of smoke rose from the chimney. Not the thick, inefficient plume that marked most cabin fires, but a controlled draw that spoke of proper combustion. Bradley frowned. Well, it draws. I'll grant him that. But drawing and heating are different matters. Come January, we'll see who's warm and who's burning through their wood supply before Groundhog Day. The men dispersed, disappointed that the immediate catastrophe they'd anticipated hadn't materialized. But the consensus remained. McLeish's design was overcomplicated, wasteful of materials, and would prove inferior when the real cold arrived. What none of them understood yet was that McLeish hadn't been building a chimney to impress them in November. He'd been building one to save them in February. Understanding what Duncan McLeish had actually built requires understanding what everyone else was building wrong. A standard Appalachian cabin chimney of the 1870s was designed for one purpose: get the smoke out. The firebox sat shallow, the flue rose straight, and the entire structure was kept as light as possible to reduce both labor and material costs. Most chimneys were built with local river stone or whatever could be hauled shortest distance, bound together with clay-based mortar. They worked after fashion. Smoke drew upward, fire provided immediate radiant heat, and families learned to sleep close to the hearth or wake up cold. But these chimneys were fundamentally inefficient heat engines. The fire produced heat, yes, but roughly 70 to 80% of that thermal energy went straight up the flue and out into the night sky. The stone, being relatively thin and often porous, absorbed minimal heat and released it almost as quickly. By midnight, even a fire that had roared at dinner would leave the far corners of a cabin approaching outdoor temperatures. McLeish's design worked on entirely different principles. First, the stone. That dense sandstone he'd hauled from 5 miles away wasn't just heavier. It was specifically selected for its thermal mass properties. Sandstone of that particular density could absorb approximately 0.22 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit. McLeish's chimney contained roughly 4,000 pounds of this stone. That meant his chimney could store an enormous amount of heat energy, not just conducted upward and away. Second, the depth. By recessing his firebox 18 inches deeper than standard practice, McLeish created what modern engineers would call a thermal battery. The fire didn't just heat the immediate firebox. It heated a massive volume of stone that surrounded it on 3 sides. That stone, once heated, would radiate warmth for hours after the fire itself had died down to coals. Third, and this is what had seemed most wrong to observers, was the angle and curve of his flue. Bradley had been right that it fought the draft, but that was precisely the point. McLeish didn't want smoke racing up the chimney at maximum velocity. He wanted it slowed just enough that the heat energy had time to transfer into the surrounding stone mass. The curved section, positioned about 4 feet above the firebox, created a natural baffle that forced hot gases to spend precious additional seconds in contact with stone before exiting. The effect was profound. Where a standard chimney might reach surface temperatures of 120 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit on its exterior, McLeish's design maintained temperatures of 180 to 200 degrees across a much larger surface area. And it maintained those temperatures not for minutes, but for 6 to 8 hours after the last log was added. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect was one that wouldn't become apparent until the structure had been used for weeks. The southeastern exposure he'd chosen meant that winter sunlight would strike the chimney's exterior mass for maximum daily duration. The stone would absorb solar heat during the day, creating a preheated thermal mass that required less wood fuel to bring up to optimal temperature each evening. McLeish had essentially built a hybrid system, part immediate heating, part thermal storage, part passive solar collection. It was the kind of integrated design that wouldn't become common in American architecture for another 100 years. On December 1st, with the first real cold settling over the valley, McLeish invited Jonas Whitfield into his cabin. Whitfield was known as a fair man, someone whose word carried weight even if he didn't speak often. The cabin was warm. Not just close to the fire warm, but genuinely warm throughout. Whitfield walked to the far corner, 15 feet from the hearth, and found he could remove his coat comfortably. The temperature difference between hearth and corner was perhaps 10 degrees, compared to the 30 or 40 degree difference common in most cabins. "How much wood did you burn today?" Whitfield asked. "One fire this morning, built up around 6. Added 4 logs throughout the day. Last one around 4 this afternoon." McLeish checked his pocket watch. "It's now past 8, and you can see we've got nothing but coals." Whitfield nodded slowly. He'd burned at least twice that much wood in the same period, and his family still huddled within arm's reach of their hearth after dark. "The stone stays hot," McLeish continued, placing his hand against the chimney's surface. "Feel it." Whitfield did. The stone radiated heat like a living thing. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "I'll not ask you to speak for me," McLeish said quietly. "But I'll ask you to speak honestly about what you've seen, should anyone inquire." Whitfield pulled his coat back on, though he didn't need to yet. "I'll speak honestly, Mr. McLeish, and I suspect by February, you'll not need anyone speaking for you at all." He was right, but the proof would come harder and colder than anyone anticipated. If you're finding this fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe, because the real test is about to arrive, and what happens next validates everything McLeish understood about thermal physics that his neighbors had dismissed as foreign nonsense. Drop a comment letting me know. Are you watching from somewhere that gets brutal winters? I want to hear your heating challenges. January 18th, 1879. The temperature began dropping at noon. By evening, the cold had taken on a quality that experienced mountain people recognized immediately. This wasn't an ordinary freeze. This was the kind of cold that killed livestock, split trees, and found every gap in every wall. The kind that would test not just comfort, but survival. Thomas Bradley added 3 extra logs to his fire at supper time, noting with concern that his woodpile, which should have lasted until March, was already diminished to concerning levels. His wife wrapped their youngest in every blanket they owned, and still the child shivered. Across the valley, similar scenes played out in cabin after cabin. Fires roared, consuming wood at rates that made families calculate nervously how long their supplies would last. Women stuffed rags into every crack around doors and windows. Men made midnight trips to wood sheds, racing against a cold that seemed determined to find its way inside no matter how high the flames rose. By midnight, the temperature had fallen to 4 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. By 3 in the morning, it had reached -12. At the Norton cabin, despite a fire that had burned continuously since 4 that afternoon, frost formed on the interior walls more than 8 feet from the hearth. Elizabeth Norton woke her husband twice, worried about the children sleeping in the loft where the temperature had dropped cold enough to see breath, even with the fire roaring below. "Should we bring them down?" she whispered, though she knew the answer. There wasn't room near the hearth for all of them, and moving meant exposing them to the brutal cold of the cabin's far reaches. "Keep the fire going," William Norton replied, rising to add another log. He didn't mention that they'd already burned through more wood in one night than they typically used in 3. At first light on the 19th, the thermometer outside the general store read -18. Samuel Garrett, opening early to sell emergency wood supplies to desperate families, discovered that his own poorly insulated storeroom had allowed 3 cans of preserved goods to freeze and burst. That's when Bradley made his way to McLeish's cabin. He'd intended to check on the Scottish immigrant, perhaps offer assistance, or, more honestly, confirm that the man's strange chimney had failed as spectacularly as predicted. What he found instead stopped him 30 feet from the door. No smoke rose from McLeish's chimney. Bradley's first thought was that the fire had gone out, that McLeish had succumbed to the cold or fled to someone else's hearth. He approached quickly, concerned despite himself. No one deserved to freeze regardless of their stubbornness about chimney design. Then he noticed the chimney itself. In the early morning light, he could see something that made no immediate sense. Heat shimmer. The kind of atmospheric distortion you'd see rising from sun-baked stone in August, except it was January and the air temperature was -18 degrees. The chimney was radiating heat. Substantial heat. Without active fire. McLeish opened the door before Bradley could knock, steam escaping around him into the frigid air. He was in shirt sleeves. "Bradley," McLeish greeted him. "Come in before you freeze." Bradley stepped inside and stopped. The cabin was warm, not just survivable, but genuinely comfortable. He instinctively moved toward the hearth, expecting to find a roaring fire, and found instead a bed of coals that barely glowed. Yet the stone chimney radiated heat like a summer day. "When did you last add wood?" Bradley heard himself ask. "Around midnight. For logs, oak. Let it burn down naturally after that." Bradley did the math. It was now nearly 7 in the morning. 7 hours, and the cabin maintained a temperature that he estimated, based purely on comfort, had to be in the mid-60s. His own cabin, with a fire that had burned continuously all night, hadn't reached 60 degrees even directly in front of the hearth. He walked to the far corner of McLeish's cabin, the spot that in his own home was currently cold enough to freeze water. Here, he could stand comfortably without his coat. The temperature difference across the room was minimal. Perhaps the corner was 5 degrees cooler than hearthside compared to the 30-degree gradient in his own cabin. "Ow!" Bradley asked simply. McLeish gestured to the chimney. The stone stores heat. Took about a month of regular firing to get the full mass properly heat-soaked, but once it reached equilibrium, the thermal retention is substantial. That 4,000 pounds of sandstone is currently holding heat energy equivalent to about 12 hours of continuous burn. It's releasing it slowly, evenly, heating the air through radiation rather than just convection from active flame. You planned this. It's not invention, Bradley. It's old knowledge. Viking homes in Iceland used similar principles. Russian stoves, Korean ondal systems. Even the Romans understood thermal mass. America's simply forgotten it in the rush to build quick and cheap. Bradley looked around the cabin again, seeing it with new understanding. The southeastern exposure that had seemed backwards now made sense, capturing winter sun to preheat the stone mass. The extra thickness of the walls nearest the chimney, which had seemed like wasteful overbuilding, now revealed themselves as additional thermal mass to absorb and distribute heat. "How much would have you burned this winter?" Bradley asked. "I keep careful measure. Since December 1st, I've burned approximately 40% of what Jonas Whitfield reports using, and he's got a nearly identical cabin size. 40%. And I'm warmer. You can verify the temperature difference yourself if you'd like to bring a thermometer." Bradley didn't need a thermometer. He could feel the difference in his bones, in the way his fingers had stopped aching, in the fact that he'd unconsciously unbuttoned his coat because the cabin was genuinely warm rather than just not deadly. Outside, the temperature had now dropped to minus 21 degrees Fahrenheit. It was officially the coldest morning in Boone County's recorded history. Families across the valley were burning through their wood reserves at catastrophic rates, making impossible calculations about whether their supplies would last until spring. And Duncan McLeish was standing in his shirt sleeves in a cabin heated by coals and physics. "I need to bring people by," Bradley said finally. "Not to mock, to learn." McLeish nodded slowly. "They're welcome." But Bradley, understanding why it works is as important as seeing that it works. "I'll not have folks trying to copy it without comprehending the principles. Done wrong, a heavy chimney is just expensive. Done right, it's the difference between survival and suffering." By noon, as word spread through the valley, a fundamental shift had begun. The weird chimney wasn't weird anymore. It was brilliant, and the man they'd called a fool was about to become the most sought-after builder in 3 counties. Jonas Whitfield arrived at McLeish's cabin on the afternoon of January 20th, carrying something rarely seen in frontier settlements: a calibrated thermometer, one of only 3 in the county, normally kept at the general store for verifying grain storage temperatures. "You'll want documentation," Whitfield said simply. "People will question this. They'll need numbers they can't argue with." What followed over the next week was the closest thing to scientific measurement that Boone County had ever conducted. Whitfield, along with Robert Hayes, and eventually even Reverend Michaels, took systematic temperature readings at multiple cabins, recording exterior conditions, interior temperatures at various distances from hearths, and wood consumption rates. The results were startling even to those who'd already witnessed McLeish's success. On January 22nd, with exterior temperatures holding steady at 6 degrees Fahrenheit, McLeish's cabin maintained an interior temperature of 67 degrees measured at its geometric center, 12 feet from the hearth. Bradley's cabin, under identical exterior conditions and with a fire that had burned continuously for 8 hours, reached only 52 degrees at the same relative distance from its hearth. Near Bradley's fire, the temperature spiked to 78 degrees, but 8 feet away it had already dropped to 58. The thermal gradient was extreme. McLeish's cabin, by contrast, showed remarkable uniformity. At the hearth, 72 degrees. At the far corner, 64 degrees. An 8-degree variation across the entire living space, compared to Bradley's 26-degree swing. But the wood consumption numbers told an even more dramatic story. Over a 7-day period from January 20th to January 27th, with temperatures averaging 11 degrees during the day and -4 at night, McLeish burned through 1/3 of a standard cord of oak. Bradley, keeping his family in comparable comfort, burned nearly 3/4 of a cord. The Norton family, struggling with a particularly poorly built chimney, consumed a full cord. Whitfield recorded it all in careful script. McLeish maintained superior comfort with 55% less fuel consumption compared to standard construction and 67% less compared to poorly designed systems. The heat retention measurements proved even more remarkable. Reverend Michaels, who had initially dismissed the design as contrary to thermodynamic principles, now found himself documenting something he couldn't quite explain with his understanding of natural philosophy. At midnight on January 24th, McLeish's last log was added to his fire, a single piece of oak approximately 12 inches in diameter. By 2 in the morning, the fire had burned down to a coal bed that barely glowed. Michaels expected the interior temperature to begin dropping rapidly, as it did in every other cabin he'd measured. Instead, the temperature held. At 3 a.m., 66 degrees. At 4 a.m., 65 degrees. At 5 a.m., 64 degrees. At 6 a.m., when most families were desperately rekindling their fires against the morning cold, 63 degrees. The chimney's surface temperature, measured with careful hand contact and comparative assessment, remained what Michaels described as hand-hot, too warm to touch comfortably for more than a few seconds, for the entire 6-hour period. It's functioning as a thermal reservoir, McLeish explained when Michaels pressed him for understanding. The stone mass absorbed heat energy during the active burn. Now it's releasing that energy slowly through radiation. The physics are straightforward. High thermal mass materials absorb heat slowly, but release it slowly as well. I've essentially built a 4,000-pound heat battery that recharges with each fire and discharges over the following hours. Samuel Garrett, ever the practical merchant, translated this into terms the community understood immediately. He's getting 12 hours of heat from 8 hours of fire, and he's using half the wood to do it. The mathematical advantage was undeniable. In a winter where wood supplies were reaching critical levels for many families, where the choice was becoming whether to stay warm or have enough fuel to last until spring, McLeish's design represented not just comfort but survival. By late January, the informal measurements had become common knowledge throughout the valley. People spoke in concrete terms now. 22 degrees warmer at the far wall. Half the wood, same comfort. Still warm at dawn without night feeding the fire. The numbers didn't lie, and mountain people, whatever their initial skepticism, respected results they could measure and verify. Elizabeth Norton, whose children had spent weeks sleeping in coats near a fire that consumed wood faster than her husband could split it, finally spoke the question others had been thinking. "Mr. McLeish, would you consider helping us rebuild our chimney? We can pay in labor, if not in cash. My children are cold, and I'm through pretending pride is worth more than their warmth." McLeish looked at the woman who, just months earlier, had refused his help with her root cellar. He saw not vindication, but simple human need. "I'll help you, Mrs. Norton, and we'll start with your cabin because your children need it most. But I'll need men willing to learn, not just to labor. This knowledge needs to spread further than I can build alone." By February, the transformation of Boone County had begun in earnest. But it wasn't just chimneys that were changing. It was the community's entire understanding of what frontier innovation could mean. Thomas Bradley stood before the congregation on the first Sunday in February and did something that frontier pride rarely permitted. He publicly acknowledged he'd been wrong. "I called Duncan McLeish a fool," Bradley said, his voice carrying across the small church. "Called his chimney an abomination. Told anyone who'd listened that old-world thinking had no place in Carolina mountains." He paused, meeting McLeish's eyes where the Scotsman sat in the back row. "I was wrong, and my family suffered for my arrogance while I stayed warm on half the wood I burned." The apology rippled through the community with more impact than any sermon. Bradley was respected, established, the man others looked to for guidance on building and construction. His admission carried weight that transcended personal pride. It represented a shift in how the community valued knowledge itself. "I'm asking Mr. McLeish to help me rebuild my chimney," Bradley continued. "And I'm asking any man who's willing to learn to join me. Not just to fix our own homes, but to understand the principles so we can build better for everyone. By mid-February, McLeish's cabin had become an informal schoolhouse. On Sunday afternoons, after church, men gathered to learn about thermal mass, heat radiation, draft dynamics, and stone selection. McLeish taught with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge, unlike firewood, increased when shared. He began with the fundamentals. Heat moves in 3 ways, he'd explain, using his own chimney as a living diagram. Conduction, heat moving through material. Convection, heat moving through air. Radiation, heat moving through space without needing a medium. Most chimneys rely almost entirely on convection from active flame. That's why you're only warm near the fire. My design maximizes radiation from heated mass. That's why the warmth spreads throughout the room. The lessons were practical, grounded in observation rather than abstract theory. He'd have men place their hands at different distances from a conventional fire versus his radiant chimney, feeling the difference in heat distribution. He'd show them how to select stone, the density, the structure, the thermal properties that made certain rocks better heat batteries than others. This sandstone, he'd explain, holding up a sample, has tiny air pockets in its structure. Those pockets slow heat transfer, which means the stone absorbs heat gradually and releases it gradually. That's what you want. River stone now, too smooth, too dense in the wrong way. It heats up fast, but it cools down fast. You want material that fights heat transfer just enough to store it. The Norton chimney became the first reconstruction project, deliberately chosen as both the most urgent need and the best teaching opportunity. McLeish supervised while Bradley, William Norton, Robert Hayes, and 6 other men did the actual labor. Each step became a lesson. See how we're angling the firebox? McLeish would point out, not just deeper, but slightly canted to direct heat into the stone mass on 3 sides. The 4th side, the cabin interior. That's where we want the heat to emerge, so we leave that surface more exposed. The work took 3 weeks, far longer than a standard chimney build, but when it was finished, the results were immediate. The Norton children slept without coats for the first time that winter. Elizabeth Norton cried when she realized her husband wasn't waking every 2 hours to feed the fire, but the cabin stayed genuinely warm through the night. It's like someone gave us back the hours we were losing to just staying alive, she told her neighbors. We have evenings now. Time to talk, to rest. We're not just surviving anymore. We're living. By late March, as winter began its slow retreat, 7 cabins in the immediate valley had either rebuilt or significantly modified their chimneys following McLeish's principles. By the following October, that number had grown to 17, and the knowledge spread beyond Boone County. Travelers carried descriptions of the Scottish chimney to neighboring valleys, where builders began experimenting with their own interpretations. Not every attempt succeeded. Some builders, lacking McLeish's understanding of the underlying physics, simply made heavier chimneys without the proper proportions or angles. These structures were expensive failures, proving McLeish's warning that copying without comprehending was worse than not trying at all. But where the principles were properly understood and applied, the results were consistent. Warmer homes, reduced fuel consumption, and families who no longer faced the brutal calculus of whether they could afford to stay warm until spring. The economic impact extended beyond individual comfort. Samuel Garrett noted in his store ledgers that sales for the winter of 1879 to 1880 were down nearly 30% compared to the previous year among families who'd adopted the new chimney design. That was wood that could be sold elsewhere, or more importantly, labor that could be directed to other survival needs rather than the endless cycle of cutting, hauling, splitting, and burning. Thomas Bradley, who'd begun the year as McLeish's chief critic, ended it as his most effective advocate. He traveled to neighboring counties specifically to teach the principles he'd learned, always crediting McLeish, but recognizing that the knowledge itself belonged to anyone who could benefit from it. Pride nearly cost my family their comfort, Bradley would tell other builders. Don't let it cost yours. This isn't about Scottish versus American, old world versus new. It's about physics. And physics doesn't care about your pride. By the spring of 1880, Duncan McLeish had built or supervised the construction of 23 chimneys. But more importantly, he'd trained 47 men in the principles that made those chimneys work. The knowledge had reached critical mass. It was now spreading through organic adoption rather than individual instruction. The weird chimney wasn't weird anymore. It was becoming standard practice. And the man they'd mocked was now the most respected builder in 3 counties. Not because he'd proven them wrong, but because he'd shown them a better way and then taught them how to do it themselves. The winter of 1881 arrived early and cold, but Boone County barely noticed. By then, 43 cabins had incorporated McLeish's thermal mass principles into their heating systems. Wood consumption across the valley had dropped by an estimated 40%. No children slept in coats. No families faced the desperate choice between warmth and having enough fuel to last until spring. The change wasn't just physical, it was philosophical. Jonas Whitfield, reflecting on the transformation during a Sunday gathering, observed something that went beyond chimney design. We were so certain we knew the right way to build because it was the way we'd always built. We mistook familiarity for expertise. McLeish showed us the difference. The lesson extended beyond heating systems. The community had learned something fundamental about the nature of knowledge itself. That wisdom doesn't always speak with a familiar accent, that innovation often looks strange before it looks brilliant, and that dismissing ideas because they're foreign says more about the dismisser than the idea. Reverend Michaels, who'd initially condemned McLeish's design as contrary to natural philosophy, now taught a different lesson. Pride tells us that what we don't understand must be wrong. Humility asks us to consider that what we don't understand might simply be knowledge we haven't learned yet. McLeish himself remained quietly productive. He continued building, teaching, and refining his designs. In the spring of 1882, he introduced a secondary innovation, a thermal mass cooking platform that used residual heat from the chimney to maintain steady cooking temperatures without active flame. Again, it looked strange. Again, it worked brilliantly. By 1885, variations of McLeish's chimney design could be found in cabins throughout western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, and southern Virginia. Local adaptations emerged. Some builders incorporated slate instead of sandstone where it was more available. Others adjusted the angles for cabins of different sizes. The core principles remained: maximize thermal mass, optimize heat retention, design for radiation rather than just convection. The economic impact was substantial. A study conducted by the county assessor in 1886 estimated that McLeish's innovation had saved valley residents over 400 cords of wood annually, with that represented roughly $2,000 in labor value. For a frontier community where cash was scarce, this was transformative wealth, not taken from anyone, but simply conserved through better engineering. But perhaps the most significant legacy was something less tangible. The community had learned to value evidence over assumption, results over reputation, and innovation over tradition for tradition's sake. Thomas Bradley, writing to his brother in Virginia in 1887, summarized the transformation. We learned the hard way that mockery is easy, but wisdom is precious. A man we called a fool taught us that our certainty was making us poor, cold, and proud of our suffering. The warmest thing he brought to this valley wasn't his chimney. It was the example that old knowledge, properly understood, can be more advanced than modern ignorance. McLeish himself never sought fame or particular credit. When a regional newspaper wanted to write an article about the inventor of the Scottish chimney, he declined, noting accurately that he'd invented nothing. He'd simply remembered what others had forgotten and adapted it to mountain conditions. The Vikings knew it, he'd say. The Romans knew it. The Koreans knew it. The Russians knew it. I just reminded Carolina that thermal mass isn't a new concept. It's an ancient one. And ancient doesn't mean primitive. Often, it means tested by centuries of people who couldn't afford to be wrong because their lives depended on being right. He passed away in 1894 at age 63 in the cabin he'd built 17 years earlier. The chimney he'd constructed that first summer was still functioning perfectly, still keeping the space warm through mountain winters, still proving every day that knowledge properly applied transcends the prejudices that might initially reject it. The cabin still stands today, preserved by the County Historical Society. The chimney, after nearly 150 winters, continues to function. Modern thermal imaging shows exactly what McLeish understood intuitively. The stone mass absorbs heat during active burning and radiates it for hours afterward, maintaining comfortable temperatures with minimal fuel consumption. Engineers who study the structure are consistently impressed by its sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics, principles that wouldn't be formally codified until decades after McLeish's design was built. He'd understood, through experience and tradition, what others would later prove with mathematics and laboratory testing. The story of Duncan McLeish's weird chimney has become something of a legend in Appalachian building traditions, but the legend misses the deeper point. This wasn't about one man's genius. It was about the danger of dismissing knowledge simply because it's unfamiliar, the cost of confusing tradition with wisdom, and the profound difference between building the way things have always been built versus building the way they should be built. Every winter, when modern Boone County residents adjust their thermostats and pay their heating bills, a few still remember that there was a time when staying warm was a matter of engineering rather than economics, when a single Scottish immigrant proved that the best path forward sometimes means looking backward to wisdom we'd forgotten we ever had. If this story changed how you think about traditional knowledge versus modern assumptions, I want to hear about it. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me, what's one piece of old-fashioned wisdom that you've discovered actually works better than the modern alternative? Because McLeish's chimney wasn't the last time ancient knowledge proved smarter than current practice. It's just one of the most measurable examples. The weird chimney wasn't weird. It was wise. And the only thing strange about it was how long it took everyone else to recognize the difference. The chimney design documented in this historical account represents specific building techniques from the 1870s to 1880s American frontier period. While the thermal mass principles are sound and well-established in modern building science, any contemporary construction project should comply with current building codes, fire safety regulations, and structural engineering standards. This documentary is intended for educational and historical purposes. If you're interested in thermal mass heating for modern applications, consult with licensed engineers and builders familiar with current safety requirements and regional building codes. The past has much to teach us, but always filter that wisdom through modern safety standards and professional expertise.